Welcome everyone to the sustainability session. I'm so pleased to be here today. My name is Emily Backus and I'm a sustainability advisor with Denver Environmental Health. And it's my pleasure to introduce our other three panelists today. First we'll be hearing from Ron Flax. He's Boulder County's Sustainability Examiner. And then Amanda Borup, who works for the Oregon Liquor Control Commission as a policy analyst, will be speaking about sustainability efforts in Oregon. Roberta Smith, who is an occupational health program manager for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, will be speaking about occupational health issues in the marijuana industry. And then finally, you'll be hearing from me. So let's go ahead and get started with Ron.
All right, thanks for having me. Just a little background about how we started on talking about sustainability within Boulder County. When Boulder County first was looking to license cannabis cultivation and distribution within Boulder County, there was a concern that we have a lot of agricultural lands and that there might be unfettered growth within the county. The image there is actually from part of the South Spain, and that was sort of the fear that we would have sort of our agricultural lands overrun with greenhouses. And so to make sure that happened in a more controlled manner, there was some pretty strong restrictions put on using agricultural lands for cultivation. So what ended up happening is that the cultivation, it was deemed as not an agricultural activity but an industrial activity, and that put a real limit on its use on the agricultural lands, which have much more lenient zoning codes. So that was sort of the first piece of it. Then within the regulations itself, we were looking at what the sustainability issues might be from this industry. At that time, the only real research that had been done into this industry was by Evan Mills out of California. Many of you might be familiar with his work. He really pioneered looking at at the cultivation of cannabis and the energy consumed in the process. So we knew that the energy consumption was a big deal, and so we kind of focused much of our regulations on dealing with that. So what we said was we wanted these grow facilities to offset the energy consumed with 100% renewables. And we were thinking that would mean on-site renewables, participation in solar gardens, and it started with just those two. What quickly became apparent was that it wasn't really possible for these grows to put enough renewable energy on their facilities. Some of it had to do with access to capital, some of it had to do with ownership, some of it just had to do with the volatility of the industry. So, and the same thing with the solar gardens. Those contracts were really designed for these long-term 20-year contracts, which was really a real problem for the industry. We ended up working out what we call the Energy Impact Offset Fund. This is a fund, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment, but it's a fund that growers can pay into based upon the energy that they've consumed. The other thing that we put in our initial round of regulations was making sure that they were safely disposing of the used lamps. Many of the lamps that are used in the industry contain mercury, and we just wanted to make sure that stayed out of the landfills. And then one issue that is really a bit of a troublesome one that we're still very much working on is trying to deal with the compostable waste stream. There's actually quite a bit of vegetative matter that's coming out of this industry, and right now a lot of that is ending up in the landfills, despite many of it being really what would be considered valuable for agricultural purposes, so in the form of compost and nutrients. So that's a bit of a tangled one. We're right now working on a pilot program trying to sort that out. It seems like this is a place where the regulations have gotten entangled with good intent and it's ended up making this part of the process really complicated and hard to pull off. We've also looked a little bit at water usage, and in Boulder County, our water issues are quite a bit different than what you might see in California. Right now, it looks like there's a fair bit of water used, but most of these cultivation facilities are using water amounts that are similar to what we see in commercial restaurants. While it's still high, does not appear to be our number one issue at the moment. So when we started talking about energy, what we realized is we were telling these growers that they're using a lot of energy, but they didn't really have any way to know how much energy they were using. It's kind of like trying to regulate your speed on the highway without a speedometer. You may get a ticket in the mail for speeding sometime down the road in the form of a utility bill, but that's really very disassociated with the moments when you're consuming that energy. So the first thing we wanted to do was make sure we had a way to give these growers real-time feedback on what they were doing with regards to energy and how much they were using, and really use that as a tool to help them learn to do better. So all the participants, and right now all of the grows in Boulder County are participating in the Energy Impact Offset Fund. They all get an energy monitoring device. We're using eGauge, which has really very, very high resolution data, and allows us to growers to really dig into their energy performance with as much detail as they might like. So the overall mission of the fund is as I say on the screen here, to try and mitigate the environmental impacts of the energy consumed by the grows. The long-term intent is to take the funds that we're collecting and use them for local projects that are designed to offset carbon, so carbon mitigation projects, local carbon projects. However, at the moment, it is quite clear that the low-hanging fruit still has to do with reducing the energy consumed. So before we really spend a lot of time looking at ways we can invest this money into carbon offset projects, we're really looking to try and learn how to do better as an industry to consume less to begin with. So I wanted to briefly just talk about how we arrived at pricing for the fund, because I think it's a pretty interesting concept in terms of how we think about the externalized costs of electrical consumption, electrical energy. So what we did to try and create a price was we took the carbon emissions of our local grid, and then we simply multiplied that by the social cost of carbon that comes out of the Office of Management and Budget in DC. So this is a federal document that tried to look at all of the externalized costs for carbon emissions. And so if you're not familiar with that process, it's actually a pretty worthwhile document. It has support from about 14 or 15 federal agencies. So it's a pretty important piece of work. And when you multiply that all out, you come up with saying, well, it's for Boulder County in 2014, which is when we did the calculation, there's an additional 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour that are externalized costs. So these are costs to society from consuming this energy that are not paid for by the consumer of that energy. So we said, okay, let's try to charge that cost. That's how we would normalize the expenditures for what it really is impacting society. And then we negotiated a little bit with the industry from there, and we came up with 2.16 cents. So that's the number we're currently using. We also did do what we call the baseline consumption value. So one of the big criticisms we received from the industry was and this is not just for these regulations, but for a lot of these regulations, all the regulations related to licensing, is that they really felt like they were getting picked on by everybody. And so they said, look, lots of other businesses consume energy. In fact, some businesses consume a lot of energy. Why are you singling out us to consume energy and no one else? And the reality is we probably should be working with all businesses to pay their fair share in terms of the environmental impacts. But the reality is we don't have the ability to do that at the moment. So what we did is we created this baseline consumption value. So we took data that showed us how much energy a typical business was consuming on average in Boulder County for similar zoning, and we subtract that out. So if these growers can get their business to consume the same amount of energy as the average commercial business, then there are no fees associated with it. So we're really just charging them for what's above and beyond the average. And that really did seem to go a long way in towards satisfying their concerns. This is just an example, just to give you some idea of what kind of money we're really talking about here. So this is data from a 5,000 square foot grow, which in Boulder County is maybe on the small side of average at this point. They've been increasing in size a bit. I know in Denver the average grow I think is quite a bit larger than that, but in Boulder County that's where we are. And what you can see here is that the offset fee is adding quite a bit. It's adding 20% or so to the utility bill. So it's not inconsequential, but it also doesn't break the bank either. So one of the things that was interesting that we saw when we started looking at the specifics of the utility data is that unlike some other commercial industries that are really energy intensive, this industry had not really been maturing to the point where they're understanding their demand profile. And in Colorado, where we have these demand rates, the peak demand makes a big difference in terms of how they're charged, and it also makes a pretty big difference in terms of the carbon intensity of the electricity that's being provided. So what you can see here are two different charts, one showing a 40% load factor, one showing an 80% load factor. The ideal would be a 100% load factor. And what this load factor means is this is the relationship of the peak of your electric consumption. So what's the most you're consuming at any one moment in time compared to the total energy you're consuming. So from a utility perspective, a steady state load would be the most efficient, where the load doesn't fluctuate up and down. And what we're seeing is that many of these businesses have actually pretty low load factors, which means that they're paying a lot for that electricity that's being consumed during a short period of time, and it's also forcing the utility to bring online less efficient forms of electricity to try and meet that peak demand. So this is one of those places where you can work with growers. Once they see it and understand it, they can actually modify their operations at relatively low operational costs and make a big difference in terms of how much money they're saving. So there's actually been a couple of examples where the growers have saved enough on demand charges that offset the fees that they were paying into the program. So they ended up at a net zero balance, at least for the first couple of years, showing just by learning how to modulate this demand. This is just another example, just giving some more data about the effect on the actual cost per kilowatt hour. And you can see there's actually a fair bit of variation from grower to grower. This data also is a little bit stale at this point, and I think our variation has actually increased just due to the volatility of the industry and the number of different players that are expanding and contracting their businesses. So I don't want to go too much into this, but this one of the advantages of having a really good energy monitoring system is that if the business wants to engage with an energy professional above and beyond what Boulder County is offering them as part of this program and as part of our PACE program, Partners for a Clean Environment, this is where we go out to businesses and help them look at all their business practices from waste stream issues to electric consumption. This data gives you the ability to really pick apart what's going on with your business and seeing what's the effect of new equipment, when equipment might be failing or going offline. So there actually are abilities to use this kind of data to really monitor business and, for instance, realize that maybe an air handler is having some kind of showing signs of early failure as the power consumption goes up. And so you can actually use this to anticipate problems with your system and not just find ways to increase efficiency. So a very, very powerful tool. So some of the lessons that we've learned since we started this, one, we learned that there's substantial opportunities for load factor improvement. There are split incentives. So this is the same thing we've been talking about in commercial energy issues for a long, long time. There's split incentives between the people who need to take action to improve the energy efficiency versus the people who benefit from that action. So the classic example is a renter who rents a property. They pay the utility bill, but the property owner would have to make the investments in the envelope improvements. This is a split incentive, and so we see is that split incentive shows up in this industry at many levels. So we'll see it where the ownership is separated from the management, or even within the company, that the people who are operating the grow rooms are not going to receive the financial benefit from reducing those utility bills, and that creates a system where progress is fairly slow to have. The other thing we learned that natural gas consumption, which we're not collecting at the moment, is a big player, and that's something I wish we had looked at more closely from the beginning. And this is especially important when we're trying to understand the distinction between a greenhouse, and we do have some greenhouses that are located on industrial zoned properties. So greenhouses versus completely indoor grows, the assumption has always been that the greenhouse is going to consume less energy. And while it's true, it is definitely consuming less lighting energy, they also seem like they probably are consuming more heating energy to keep those places warm during those moments when the lights are off in the wintertime. So there's a balance there. We don't really know where it is, and without good gas data, it's really hard to sort that out. The next one on this list, and this is probably the single most important problem that we're facing right now, which is that we don't have good production data. When I had laid out this program, I assumed that we would have access to the production data that's being collected by the state, but that's not the case. We can't access it, and despite the fact that we're trying to do government-funded research, we just can't get a hold of any of this data. And the data is also very high resolution. So right now, the state is tracking these plants on a plant-by-plant basis. They're barcoding everything. They know exactly what's going in and out of these facilities, and we don't. So we can't correlate how much energy is being consumed to how much product is being produced. So without that piece of it, number, we can tell you what the energy consumed is, but we don't really know what the true efficiency of the operation is. And without that, we can't give growers baselines, so they can't understand how they compare to other businesses. We can't establish good targets. So it's a huge problem that seemingly shouldn't be there. And then the final piece of it is that the many of the major problems we see with HVAC systems, which is the dominant load in these right after the lighting loads, many of those problems are exactly the same problems we see in other commercial buildings. We see the same kinds of incomplete commissioning, set points and thermostats that aren't operating, dampers that stuck, all the normal stuff that we see in commercial buildings. We see here, it's just magnified because the energy intensity is higher than so many other businesses. The other piece of it is that we didn't properly account for when we first laid out this program was the infused product manufacturing. This is a big deal. And right now, all the energy had always been looking at the cultivation, and I think part of that is that our Colorado market is a little different than what we've seen elsewhere. But this is a big deal. First of all, there's a fair bit of energy consumed in just some of these commercial kitchens. That's again the same as any other commercial kitchen, but it needs to be looked at. But the other is that we're dealing with a lot of combustible materials, and the result of that is that we have a lot of really laboratory-style ventilation systems that are dealing with these combustible solvents. And the mechanical systems have to deal with these high ventilation rates, make up air for these ventilation rates, and the consumption of the devices, the compressors that are operating this equipment. So this is something that has been completely ignored up until now. We don't have good energy data on this, and if you were to ask me to point to where I think our program should expand, I think we really need to be looking at these manufactured infused products a little more closely, because right now it's simply being ignored. And we don't really have good numbers for it, but we do know that it's quite substantial. There are some papers that are starting to come out now. This is two sources. One is by EQ Research, by Kelly Crandall, and there's also a paper by eSource. These are starting to look at what's going on here in Colorado and elsewhere, but just using more current information than has been that's been available before. And I would also keep your eyes open. There's a study that's ongoing right now that the Marijuana Industry Energy Use Report by the Colorado Energy Office, and I expect to see great things from that. We're providing our data to that program, and hopefully, if they are able to pull the production data away from the state, we can actually really start to understand in detail what's going on. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Amanda Borup. I'm a policy analyst with the Oregon Liquor Control Commission. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Oregon recreational program and its relation to sustainability. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is just a little bit about how Oregon's set up. So voters passed Ballot Measure 91 in November of 2014. In 2015, the legislature put out a handful of bills, including House Bill 3400, that really changed the ballot measure and made it a lot larger, a lot more robust, and added responsibilities of state agencies. And so those have all been combined at this point into Oregon Revised Statutes 475B. The OLCC has administrative rules under this, and those are called our Division 25 administrative rules. And what we do, OLCC, we have the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, we have the authority to regulate commercial recreational marijuana businesses, which are the producers, the growers, the processors, wholesalers, and retail establishments. The Oregon Health Authority still has the full regulatory control over the medical program. The Oregon Medical Program was established in 1998, and it revolves around patient cards and caregivers. It has been expanded into retail dispensaries at this point in time, and so some of those retail dispensaries are still acting as medical-only dispensaries. Some of them will transfer into the recreational system. The Oregon Department of Revenue is now the tax collecting body. Initially, the ballot measure gave the Oregon Liquor Control Commission the authority to collect the tax, and that was changed. The Oregon Department of Agriculture is responsible for the commercial licensing the commercial kitchens. And so they'll go in like they would any other commercial kitchen in Oregon, and they'll do their food inspections, and they'll do the licensing. They also do the weights and measurement certifications, as they would with any other business in Oregon. And they deal with the pesticide usage. As we've talked about through the past couple of days, the label's the law, and so the Department of Agriculture is making sure that that's followed through with in Oregon. And then local jurisdictions have really robust time, place, and manner allowances within the law, and they can also opt out completely. So we've had a lot of counties, especially on the eastern side of our state, that have completely opted out of recreational marijuana, and some that have opted out of medical marijuana as well. And then others who have stayed in have made very strict time, place, and manner as far as their zoning and distance requirements, setback requirements, other requirements such as like odor mitigation and things like that, that make it so that it's a lot more difficult for a business to be able to set up within that jurisdiction, even though they didn't completely opt out. So within 475B and then the OLCC administrative rules, we touch on sustainability in a couple different ways. I think probably the biggest, easiest way to look at it is through our land use compatibility statement. And so this was through House Bill 3400, which was 2015 legislation. And what it does is it requires the local jurisdiction to sign off on a land use compatibility statement for any recreational business. And the statement is basically a zoning statement, but it also can include any time, place, and manner from the local jurisdictions. So for example, if a local jurisdiction has said no marijuana business can be outside of this commercial zoned area, they would go ahead and deny the statement if it was outside of that area, and then the OLCC would deny the application in turn. So it's really the first step in our application process. And also what it does is it gives local jurisdictions a chance to meet with the applicants before they've even started planning their business. So local jurisdictions know what's planning on going into their jurisdiction, what type of activities they're going to be doing, and then what the OLCC does at the time of licensure, we actually send the land use compatibility statement back to the local jurisdiction. So then they're aware that that applicant is now licensed, and they could go out and pay them a visit if they need to. If they need to update them on any codes or any building codes or anything like that, they can work with them internally. And it actually works out really well because based on a little bit of 2016 legislation, the addresses of producers, processors, and wholesalers are exempt from the public record. We can share them with state agencies, we can share them with local and county or city officials, but this gives the local jurisdictions a nice way to be able to track that without having to call the Liquor Control Commission all the time. House Bill 3400 also requires producer licenses to have water and energy estimates at the time of application. And so it's called a report in the law. So what we've done is that initial application, we're requiring them to estimate the amount of water and energy they plan on using. And then at recertification, they're going to turn in actuals. And so what we'll be able to do with the Department of Energy in Oregon is look at the data from our seed to cell tracking system based on their water and electric usage and be able to get some actually good data about how much water is being used, how much electricity is being used, and be able to use that as we're moving forward. One of the reasons it's gonna work, hopefully, it's gonna work pretty well, is that another part of the law makes it so that the OLCC establishes canopy limits. And so the way cultivation in Oregon happens is based on a mature flowering plant canopy, and we have tiers for this limit. Another part of the law says that we have to have indoor production and outdoor production equal, which is pretty difficult. So what we did was we made our tiers on a 4-to-1 ratio. So an outdoor production can be 4 times as large as indoor production. And the reason for that, in Oregon, an outdoor grow will only harvest 1 time per year. And an indoor grow, though they could harvest more than 4 times, on average, for a safe starting point, we went for 4 times the size. What the law didn't touch on was greenhouses. And greenhouses is a very, very common way of cultivation for other agricultural crops in Oregon. So what we've said at the OLCC through our administrative rules is that a greenhouse that's using artificial light on mature flowering plants is indoor. And then a greenhouse that is using no artificial light on their mature flowering plants is outdoor. So without having it in the law, we basically have made a way that people can use greenhouses because in a lot of ways they are saving energy rather than just being in warehouses in the city. Verification of legal access to water was an ask from the Oregon Water Resources Department, and so we put that into our administrative rules. So what people have to do when they apply is either provide that they have well rights, first of all, or they're receiving water from a municipal source, or they're having their water supply trucked in. Since Oregon has varying climates throughout the state, in the Willamette Valley, for example, water isn't really that much of an issue. We have adequate water supply. But in Eastern Oregon, they don't have that same water supply, and they don't in Southern Oregon either. So people are getting their water in many, many different ways. And so we just want to verify that they're getting those legally. They're not taking them from streams or rivers as they may have in the past. House Bill 3400 also established the Task Force on Cannabis Environmental Best Practices. So the task force had representation of 2 senators, 2 representatives, the Department of Energy, Oregon Water Resources Department, the Oregon Department of Agriculture, the Oregon Energy Trust, the Oregon Public Utility Commission, 2 individuals from the cannabis industry who were growers, somebody from the IBEW, and also Portland General Electric. And so really what this did was allow all of these groups come together who've been talking about water and energy usage and be able to have public discussions with the industry at the table as well about what are the best practices around cannabis best practices around cannabis cultivation. And the job was to make recommendations to the legislature about energy and water usage best practices. And so it was, I think one of the most difficult parts at the beginning was the fact that it was a very, very small area that we were making recommendations on. We weren't making recommendations on the way you cultivate marijuana. We weren't making recommendations on pesticides or any type of growing practices. It really was more about the energy and the water, and that was it. So we had 5 meetings over the past year, really took the time to talk to state agencies, to talk to, like, for example, the Oregon Farm Bureau, Nursery Association, current medical growers, third-party certification bodies, just to be able to see really what people wanted, how we could reach these goals. And up on the screen, you can see what our recommendations are. One of the first, I think, and probably one of the most important, is education and technical assistance. Because the industry was working in an illicit market or somewhat illicit market for such a long time, it's really important to be able to let them know you can connect with your utility companies. You can talk to the Water Resources Department. Everybody wants to make sure that it's a success and that it is working, and so you don't have to hide what you're doing. You don't have to work on electricity on your own. You know, Energy Trust of Oregon has some great incentive programs that are out there, but people are kind of still a little hesitant about reaching out. And so a lot of the conversation was about how do we open up the conversation? You know, how do we really bring the industry in, let them know that there are resources available and that they can be successful and have an energy and water efficient operation. The voluntary third-party certification programs is also very important. Since cannabis is federally illegal, they can't use the term organic because that's owned by the USDA. And so everybody wants to say they're organic though. And you know, and a lot of people are using practices that are very similar to organic practices, but yet they can't say that. They can't use that in their marketing, they can't use it on their packaging, anything. So these third-party certification companies can actually help the industry a lot because they can put into place best practices and practices that are somewhat the same as organic practices. And then those producers can be able to say, you know, we've done A, B, C, and D, and this is the way that we've shown that we're, you know, as close to being organic as you can be without being. A good example of a voluntary, it's more of an industry-driven third-party certification program, is the VINE program. The VINE program was set up by the Oregon wine growers, and basically what they did was they realized that they wanted to be able to market their product in a way to say that they were sustainable, but there wasn't a way that they were really happy with being able to do that. So they got together and they worked with the Oregon Department of Agriculture to set up this program. And so the industry really made it themselves. And now, I think it's been around, well, I don't know exactly how long, but it's a very successful program. And they use the marking on their bottles and on their wine, and people actually look for that when they're buying wine, to know that it was grown sustainably. The resources for research. As Ron was talking about earlier, you know, there is more research coming out now, but there's still not a lot of research around the environmental best practices because it was in the illicit market for so long. And so we really were hoping that the Oregon legislature will either give funding to research bodies or be able to give funding to people that apply for a licensed research certificate through the state of Oregon, so we can really look at outside research rather than the data coming from the state, but actually look at companies who are focused on the research and the issues of sustainability. Another part of that would be a Department of Agriculture Commodity Commission. So Oregon has many commodity commissions. I believe we have about 23. So it would be like a wheat commodity commission, and that's where the industry actually funds its own commission. The Department of Agriculture oversees it, and then they can use that money for their marketing, for research, and things like that. So this would be pulling the cannabis more so into the Department of Agriculture as other crops. And I guess I should mention, through House Bill 3400, the 2015 legislation, cannabis is considered a farm crop in Oregon. Oh, I went too quick. So the water regulations, currently in Oregon, a lot of people in Oregon have domestic wells. Domestic wells cannot be used for commercial production. So if you have a domestic well, you could use that for your yard, you could use it for your personal garden, you could use it for your personal animals, that's fine. But if you are planning on taking any produce from your garden to the farmer's market, you wouldn't be able to use your domestic well for that. And so the same thing goes for cannabis. If you're growing commercial cannabis, you wouldn't be able to use your domestic well for that purpose. So That it was just part of the task force recommendation to have the legislature look at that to see if that's adequate for small-scale farmers, whether it be cannabis or other types of farmers in Oregon. And then what the OLCC has done, just as kind of a starting point, we actually got this idea from Washington State. They had a work group that made a similar publication for Washington. We made the Business Readiness Guidebook. And I like to say that this is actually would be good for anybody thinking about starting a business in Oregon. I mean, it has all kinds of information about really what you need to do to run a successful business. We talk about land use, we talk about workplace safety, taxes, pesticide use, air emissions, health insurance, and also energy use. And so really, when you flip through it, you can see what state agencies, what other organizations or other government bodies you would need to connect with in order to make sure you're running the best business possible. And then last but not least, I have our website here. We have all of the information I just talked about on our website, and the Business Readiness Guidebook's there as well, and it's updated probably every 2 weeks. And so in the bottom corner, we always have the latest version. I think it's really helpful just to flip through because you can kind of see when you look through it all of the different areas that this is hitting on within our state. And it's kind of a nice compilation of how everybody's trying to work together and make this be as big of a success as we can, but also have it be a sustainable industry. Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome. And I'm Roberta Smith, and I'm actually a nurse and an industrial hygienist, and I work in occupational health at the State Health Department here in Colorado. So you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with sustainability? But when we look at the pillars of sustainability, there's the economic factors, there's the people factors, and the economic factors when we look at our pillars of sustainability. So today I'm going to give a little bit of a background on our social or people factors when we are looking at making a business, making this industry more sustainable. So of course, being an industrial hygienist, I always have to talk about our hierarchy of controls and orient people to how we look at hazards in the workplace. And really, our objective is to have an injury-free workplace. And you can do this through many mechanisms. And the first one that we look at is elimination, and eliminating the hazard altogether. The second step to that is substitution. Can we take a hazardous situation or a hazardous product and perhaps substitute it with something that's less harmful or less hazardous? Next is our engineering control. So this is, we know we have a hazard that exists. What can we do to mitigate that hazard? What kind of controls, what type of ventilation systems can we put into place to make that hazard less? And next is our administrative controls. These are more within your policies and how you might be rotating workers in the workplace and having work schedules throughout the day and anything that can be controlled from a policy standpoint. And finally, the low thing here is PPE and protecting workers with PPE and gloves and gowns and everything. So with the state of Colorado in the public health sector, we actually are putting together a guidance, so similar to what Amanda was talking about in terms of her small business guidance. We have looked at some of the hazards that exist in the marijuana industry, and we're putting together a guide for best practices on how to eliminate those hazards. And again, this could probably apply to any small business, but again, as a new industry, as an industry that's coming from maybe a smaller operation to a larger operation, it's very critical that people understand these hazards. And these hazards have actually been classified per many standard ways of classifying hazards into biological, chemical, and physical hazards. So all of these will be important here when we talk about sustainability. So I'm just going to run through these hazards just to give you an idea of what we've identified in this document. And first we have mold. So when you're working in a wet environment, a humid environment, mold can definitely be an indoor air quality issue. Sensitizers, both dermal and respiratory, can also be an issue for workers that are working with the plants and other chemicals perhaps that are used in your industry. Now, the chemical hazards, I think we can all understand the scope and breadth of the chemical hazards, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, indoor air quality. When we look at volatile organic compounds, you can, if your HVAC system might be entraining air from a local highway or other operations that are nearby, that can certainly influence your indoor air quality as well as some of the terpenes. Pesticide use, so the application of pesticides and what pesticides are used in each facility can also influence your potential hazards. And disinfectants and cleaning chemicals, what we're using to clean the facility and clean machinery between grows definitely can come into play as a hazard to employees. And then nutrients and corrosives, so if you're mixing these things and preparing these at the facility, that can present a unique hazards as well. When we look at the physical hazards, the list gets a little bit longer here in the industry and what can be a potential physical hazard. So flammable and combustible liquids, I think, is a big one, and this generally, unfortunately, makes the headlines when there's an issue with these hazards. Compressed gases, so having those, again, these are a lot for our extraction processes that we're going to see these substances and the hazards. If your compressed gases aren't hooked down appropriately, they can actually be like a bottle rocket through your facility and really create a bad physical hazard. Occupational injuries, so any cuts that workers may have, slips, trips, falls, those are all real. Again, a lot of these physical hazards we're going to find in any industry. Workplace violence is another one that's being focused on just because the nature of the business and maybe a high target industry. Walking and working surfaces, again, we talked about it being a wet area, so we're using water. We may have water on the floors that create slip hazards. Working at heights, so if you're hanging things, you're working from ladders, if you're doing any kind of maintenance up on your roof, this definitely can be a potential hazard to your employees. And electrical. So we've talked a lot about electrical use, and it also can be a potential hazard to your employees based on what types of electrical equipment you have. If your facility hasn't been designed appropriately and you've got extension cords running here and there, we'll look at that when we talk about the sustainable design here. But electrical is one of the biggest physical hazards. Noise, I'm not sure how much of this is a problem in your facility or what you've encountered, but again, in a warehouse setting, a large setting, you could potentially have noise issues that you would want to consider. Environmental hazards, so again, just kind of your working environment and what your workers are being exposed to. Powered industrial trucks or any kind of moving equipment. Lighting hazards, I think when we think of worker safety, this is another big one that comes to mind, is we're using such high intense lighting and different types of lighting that you can actually have injuries with that. Not only visible injuries, the metal halide lamps have actually been known to explode. So you can have those hazards, and you can also have the hazard of fire with lighting systems actually being too intense and too hot. Machines, so wood chippers, grinders, I've seen all of these as we walk around facilities. Again, making sure we have the proper tools on there for machine guarding, and then potentially confined spaces. So what does this have to do with sustainability? We've looked at the hazards and everything, and how does this tie back to sustainability? Well, NIOSH, back in 2007, so NIOSH is the National Institute for Occupational Health and Safety. They actually started seeing that sustainability and LEED design, so designing efficient buildings and workspaces, was, kind of up and coming. The United Nations had actually, back in 2000, started recognizing engineering and sustainability as kind of the upcoming issues and what we're looking at for all industries. And so NIOSH got on board with all of the LEED certifications, and when we look at facilities, when we look at designing a sustainable workplace, how are we putting workplace safety into that, and how can we make choices that are sustainable, that are also potentially eliminating these hazards for our employees? So I put up here kind of the definition, and so NIOSH has a program called Prevention Through Design, and they've used a model where you actually look at designing out potential occupational safety and health hazards and the risks, and looking at new processes and structures and equipment and tools that would actually be more sustainable and also be less risky for employees. And this contributes to all of our benefits, those pillars of sustainability. So again, kind of going back to our hierarchy of controls that I started with and building in sustainability into that practice. So when we look at designing something out or eliminating it entirely, then that is, potentially helping us be more sustainable, but also reducing our hazards. And as you move down that, the hierarchy of controls, you can kind of see the business value and the control effectiveness kind of decreases. So that elimination and substitution, when it comes to sustainability, those are going to be kind of our biggest gains that we can make there. And NIOSH, actually, on their prevention through design, they've got a couple white papers that they've produced just recently and have some examples of how this has been done successfully in many industries. Amanda talked about the wine industry, and that is, again, where some of this prevention through design has been effectively done as well. So taking that model and looking at sustainability, looking at our hazards, how can we actually put these two together and reduce our hazards? So going back to our biological hazards and talking about mold, just reducing your water use and those puddles and being more efficient with your water use is going to eliminate a lot of our slips, trips, and falls. So again, it's kind of, if you're someone that's putting a business case together for sustainability, you've got two wins right there, both on your worker safety and potential claims that you might be having, as well as your water reduction and bills associated with that. So, mold's going to grow wherever things are wet, so being really efficient in your water use and water cleanup. So a couple examples that would tie back to our chemical hazards. So looking at our cleaning and disinfection chemicals, making sure that you're substituting a product. So if you want to be sustainable and you want to use a green product, the thing, and my background is actually also in infection control, so I've worked with cleaning and disinfection in hospital settings for many years, and you really want to make sure that the chemical you're choosing, although it might be, a good, green, sustainable chemical, is actually being effective for the organisms that your facility might be encountering. So really looking at that. But again, if you're using a harsh bleach in an area that's not very sustainable, it's going to cause a lot of indoor air quality issues, irritations. So again, going back to a greener, maybe hydrogen peroxide product would be a lot better for the workers. And that also helps with some of the volatile organic chemicals. And again, either eliminating those or substituting those. Also looking at your engineering controls, such as ventilation and your HVAC systems. So if you move to a more efficient HVAC system when you're trying to lower energy costs, just make sure that you're not creating a hazard then for your employees where you've eliminated a control that's actually helping reduce some of the indoor air quality problems. And then with nutrients and corrosives, we do see a hazard here with employees mixing those, maybe purchasing nutrients that have been pre-mixed if that's something that might be available. So looking at our physical hazards, and again, tying this back to sustainability, for noise, there's actually a program, it's called Buy Quiet and Engineer Quiet, and Quiet by Design. And so these are, if you've got an old piece of equipment that's rattling and shaking, that might not be actually your best energy efficient piece of equipment anyway. So, making sure you're repairing that and fixing that so it's not creating loud noises, and being conscious about your purchases that you're making in your facility. Again, you're probably want to purchase energy efficient as well as something that won't become a hazard for employees. Looking at electrical hazards, again, in designing a space, if you're reducing your energy loads or wanting to reduce that, that's also going to have a benefit on your workers and their worker safety. Making sure that equipment is maintained and well running, you don't have frayed cords or anything like that. That's probably going to be a pretty big energy suck for your industry as well. So making sure everything is up to date and running efficiently. Lighting hazards. I think when we do talk about sustainability, we talk a lot about our lighting choices and making sure that if we're changing bulbs, that some of the fluorescent bulbs, as Ron had stated, have mercury in them, and you've got to have proper handling for that, for not only the safety of the environment, but also mercury exposures potentially for your employees. So making your choices in lighting, again, that can be beneficial for the environment and for your employees. And I talked a little bit about the metal halide bulbs, and those are very intense energy use and they're very hazardous. So again, considering all of this in your design. And we talked a little bit about the slip, trips, falls as relates to water use and how that can be reduced in water efficiency. So I touched on this a little bit, but when we are designing facilities to be sustainable, let's not create new hazards as well. So when you look at LEED engineering, you want to use a lot of natural light, and sometimes that might be the case, and you maybe add a skylight to a facility. Well, there are actually safety considerations that you need to put into place for skylights in case any of your workers are on the roof. You don't want them falling through that skylight. So there's a lot of safety and OSHA guidelines that go around with that. Green rooftops, I think that's another piece of design that people want to have these living roofs and kind of help reduce their offset that way. But again, you want to look at, if you're designing this, do you have adequate fall protection? If it's something that's going to be maintained by employees going up there, are they going to be safe in that maintenance? And I kind of circle back again to the lighting. So when we change out lighting, we want to make sure that if we are reducing lighting in one area, that we actually have enough lighting for our employees to work safely. So when you're looking at redesigning a facility and switching maybe where your energy consumption is coming, again, thinking about the employer safety with all of those decisions and making sure that you don't create new hazards when you're designing for eco-friendliness. So here are some of the NIOSH recommended prevention through design tools, and I think they're really simple. And using that risk assessment process when we're doing audits for our energy, can we tie that in somehow with doing a risk assessment and looking at, what are we doing to promote zero harm to both people and the environment? Using that hierarchy of controls to really eliminate things that might not need to be there, and again, enhancing your safety and energy profile. And investigating incidents, this is always good as a safety practice to see if there's what the root cause is, and is it something that can be changed or substituted in your design. And again, getting senior management on board, because they're probably going to be the ones making some of the energy decisions and making sure that employee safety and worker safety isn't forgotten in that whole process. So NIOSH has some great tools on their website, so I would refer you there. And also the ASSE, the American Society of Safety Engineering, had a great two-part series on prevention through design in their professional safety magazine. And this has some really good examples on how this has been used in other industries as well. And I'm happy to help you out too later. So thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Great. I'm Emily Backus. As I mentioned before, I'm a sustainability advisor with Denver's Certifiably Green Denver program. And thanks so much for our other three speakers. I think they gave a really good overview of some of the sustainability challenges in the industry. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done to collaborate with the industry to learn more about some more sustainable practices and encourage the industry to implement those. So just a little bit about the program that I work on. We're the city's green business program. So we provide technical assistance and recognition to all types of businesses throughout the city on environmental issues. And here's a few of our metrics. Our goals are to conserve energy and water, reduce the environmental impacts of Denver businesses. And we realized when cannabis became legal, specifically when retail cannabis became legal, that we needed to be able to provide the same services, the same expert advising technical assistance to cannabis businesses as we do to other businesses in Denver. And so that's how we started down the road of working with the cannabis industry. Areas of concern that we identified right away: energy, water use and wastewater quality, solid waste issues, both the waste coming out of the facility as well as the packaging associated with the products that people are taking home, and worker health and safety, which Roberta did a great job covering. Opportunities, I threw up a word cloud out there. There's a ton. There's so much technology developing. It's hard to stay on top of it, and I think that's one of the exciting things about working with this industry. There's certainly significant sustainability challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities, and that's what we were really excited to learn about. So what's keeping the industry from being more sustainable or adopting these new technologies or better practices for sustainability? There's a few different things at play here. The first one, and certainly I think the most significant, is that the best practices are unknown, or we might have an idea of what they might be, but they aren't really proven, or they're still being developed. The second is that there is a historic culture of secrecy that came from the industry being illicit for so long. For a long time, many growers didn't want to share with one another what their practices were because they felt that those practices gave them a competitive edge. The good thing is that this is diminishing quite a bit. We've found that many more growers, as the years have progressed, are willing to talk to not just each other, but to us, the government, about what they're doing. So this is something that's really improving, which is great. A third one is distrust of new equipment and technology, because some really poorly performing products have been sold in the past few years. And this really comes to in play with LED lighting. In, I would say, 2012 through 2014, 2015, there was a flood of LED lights marketed towards the cannabis industry on the market, and just about all of them did not live up to the claims that the producers claimed. And so now many growers are wary of these products, not wanting to try them out. They don't believe that there could be good products. Federal funding barriers to university research, so getting that academic peer-reviewed research is very difficult due to funding barriers. The technology is developing very rapidly, so things that we might recommend today aren't going to be the same as what we would recommend in 5 years. And the wide variation in growing techniques and styles means that one technology doesn't suit all growers. So we couldn't necessarily recommend a certain piece of equipment and say, everybody should have this in their facility to reduce energy, because it depends on what strains you're growing, what watering application you're using, whether you're in a greenhouse or indoor. All of these things come into play in terms of what are the best practices for an individual facility. So how did we get started? Our engagement began when medical facilities began to move from small, home-based into larger facilities, and really the department got engaged over the issue of odors. So that was the very beginning of our program's engagement with the industry. We developed a relationship with a local entrepreneur who was passionate about sustainability and owned several cannabis businesses about 4 years ago. And we started hosting regular informal meetings in 2014. So this was a monthly meeting. It was anyone who's interested can come. We really met a wide swath of people from the industry with differing viewpoints. And really what we were asking them each month is, what are you seeing? What are your concerns? What types of new technology are you excited about? We were really just trying to wrap our heads around what is sustainability in the cannabis industry. And then at the end of last year, we formalized these informal meetings into the Cannabis Sustainability Work Group. So we had an open application process to convene 15 members from within the industry, as well as folks who are sustainability experts and people in government to work together on the Cannabis Sustainability Work Group. So the overall approach is to utilize an existing non-regulatory program like ours, and I think many other states and jurisdictions have maybe not a green business program, but another program where you're providing that non-regulatory assistance. And I really recommend that you, if you have one of those types of programs, utilize that for outreach with their industry, to engage the stakeholders, determine what your priorities are locally, engage the larger community, and provide education. If you can utilize rebates as a carrot, it's incredibly powerful. We've been working with our local utility. They are providing some rebates, energy rebates to the industry. And then ultimately, we would like to be able to measure results, and that's something that I would highly recommend you, if you're developing a program, build into the initial design of your program. Tips, if you want to develop something similar to our work group, or just have a network of people in the industry that you're working with. Creating trust between growers and government is essential. They're used to people coming in their facilities and inspecting them and giving them fines and all sorts of things, and really it goes back to what I said earlier about utilizing a non-regulatory program. They know that you're not there to inspect them, and so it creates this relationship of trust and open sharing. Start with someone you know and expand from there. With us, it literally started with one business owner, and it grew from there. Host regular open meetings. All of our meetings are open to the public. I warn people that sometimes they might be boring, but anyone can attend, and we encourage everyone. There's no peanut gallery. We have everyone come sit at the table and ask their questions, and we found that to be really valuable. And finally, ask for a tour if you're interested in the technologies that these facilities are implementing. I hope some of you join the tours on Wednesday. Most growers that are excited about sustainability and interested in sustainability want to show you what they're doing, and they're excited to hear from government officials that aren't there just to inspect them. They usually want to share it with you. So I think I've touched on this a little bit, but utilizing the expertise of people working in the industry is really the best way that we've learned. Growers know what works and what doesn't. Their facilities are living laboratories for new technologies. Many facilities have a little corner dedicated to testing out new lights, things like that. Getting the growers to share what they know with one another is one of our greatest challenges, that historic culture of secrecy, but it's also our best opportunity for learning. And companies that make related technology, the lighting, HVAC systems, odor control technologies, soil amendments, all of these products, they're a great source of information and expertise. In many cases, they're recruiting engineers and scientists from other industries that are really, really knowledgeable to help develop their products. But be careful. There's definitely exaggerated performance claims have been on products before, and I don't think that will necessarily go away. So I would say, tap into these people and talk with them and learn from them, but also, be a little cautious. So we've been collaborating with partner agencies and organizations, working with our local utility, especially working with neighboring municipalities. We've been working really closely with Boulder County, and actually a staff member from Boulder County sits on our work group. And that's really an opportunity to streamline programs, right? You don't need to duplicate this effort with the city that's right next door. Your related agencies, so I work for environmental health, but we're doing this work very close collaboration with the Office of Marijuana Policy and other agencies as these areas intersect. And then universities and nonprofits, tremendous opportunity to utilize their expertise and also to share information. So what are we doing with this work group? Our main product that we're looking to produce is a free best management practices manual. So taking all of these things that we've learned and actually setting down, these are the things that are good to do for the environment. That's just going to cover indoor cultivation, since that's the type of cultivation we have here in Denver. And we expect to release it in spring of next year. It's in development right now. We started a survey of cannabis businesses on environmental practices. So we're hoping that it'll be pretty broad in terms of the scope of what it covers. We're very excited to see the new Colorado Energy Office report that Ron mentioned, but this will cover things like waste and other issues. And we just had the first Cannabis Sustainability Symposium. So if you weren't here on Wednesday, we had over 200 people from across the country, actually I should say from across North America, attend. It was a great event, and we're definitely looking to continue that into next year, to hold another symposium, and also hopefully hold some shorter workshops throughout the year. So recognition. So one of the key cornerstones of our program is recognition. That's why we're called Certifiably Green Denver. So how do we find that fit? At the beginning, we had cannabis businesses coming up to us and saying, can we get certified? And we thought, well, why not? And of course, realizing that there weren't established best practices led us down this road. We can't set criteria for certification until we know what those criteria should be. So right now we're certifying cannabis retail stores under our existing retail standards. They're really not any different from any other retail stores in terms of sustainability. So that's Legal Services. They became the first cannabis retail store to be certified. we've gotten interest in our certification program from cultivators, and we may develop a certification if we continue to have interest from them. There are other third-party certification options that Amanda mentioned, and so we might not need to develop this. We only develop a certification if it's what that industry wants. But if we were to do that, it would be based on the best management practices that we've developed. And basically what we would do, and this is what we do with any industry that we're developing a new certification for, is bring together a group of stakeholders to determine what should be the requirements for the certification, what should be the electives, and what are really the standards for the certification. So we still have a lot to learn. Much more data and research is needed. Everything's going to continue to change rapidly, and staying on top of it is one of our biggest challenges. But I think it's exciting, and I think I hope that what we've learned we can share with all of you. Part of the idea of putting together the best management practices manual is so that you don't have to. But we're definitely looking for input on all of that and to continue to share and help make this industry more sustainable. So we have some time for question and answer, about 15 minutes. So I hope you all have been thinking about what you want to learn from us, and I'm going to take my seat.
Very nice presentation, thank you. My name's Tom Smith with CannaScore. Before we used to publish compliance regulations for the cannabis industry, we were real active in safety and health and hazmat. So I have actually 3 questions. First of all, Roberta, you had mentioned that your department, Public Health, is doing all of the NIOSH physical hazard inspections. Now, I know the state of Colorado is an OSHA-based state. Is OSHA not involved because of the federal laws outlawing cannabis? Is that why you're doing it, or do you work in conjunction with OSHA?
So I'm at the state public health department, and we do not have an OSHA program here. So I have no enforcement. So I am working collaboratively with other industrial hygienists and safety folks to create a best practices guideline. So a lot of those best practices are based off of OSHA guidelines, you know, your standard, what you should put into a safety program. But OSHA can actually, in the state of Colorado, if there is a complaint from a worker or a fatality, they can come in still, just like any other industry. It's just that the cannabis industry is not on their lottery for inspections.
Yeah, I'd heard that. That's why I asked the question.
Right. So there's no, regular safety inspections that are really, apart from maybe what municipalities are able to do, that are happening. So that's why it's such an important thing that industries, when they start developing their programs, incorporate safety into that, because there's probably going to be a time where that needs to be happening. But as safety professionals, right, we want to keep our workers safe. And it's not about, because so-and-such is going to come and see if we're doing this. It's the right thing to do, and it's the right thing to keep your workers happy and healthy and productive working for you. So that's why we've put together this guideline, is to just give a foundation on, okay, these are the recognized hazards, and this is what you should be working towards as a safety program to achieve.
Okay, so there actually isn't, you aren't doing any enforcement,
No.
you're just
No, I'm
recommending.
collaborating. And as Emily said, I've gone to a couple facilities, and it's great, the transparency, and to be able to talk to them on a one-on-one and say, hey, I'm not here to regulate you from my position. I work in public health. So I'm, just really concerned about them having the tools and the resources, and what I can do to help them out is great.
Great.
So,
I'd like to talk to you a little later then.
Absolutely.
My second question actually is for Amanda. Because even though CannaScore is based here in Denver, I live over in the Northwest and have homes both in Washington and Oregon. And I know you're with OLCC, but what is OROSHA doing with regards to the cannabis industry? Because again, like Washington and Oregon, we're cowboys. We like to do things more effectively than the rest of the world.
So it's actually a really similar answer to Roberta's. Oregon OSHA will come in on complaints. They've also, the Business Readiness Guidebook I talked about, there's a lot of information in there directly from OSHA. The Department of Agriculture works really, really closely with OSHA. And so at a couple of times so far, if there's been pesticide issues, and that is getting investigated by Department of Agriculture based off of an employee complaint, Oregon Department of Agriculture will go with Oregon OSHA into the establishment, and they'll both be having investigations. Okay. And so they're pretty active in our process. We collaborate. I mean, we're pretty lucky, really, the way our laws are written. The state agencies can share information between each other. Aside from the health authority, they have to keep their patient information separate due to HIPAA violations, and HIPAA rules. But for the recreational side, we work with DEQ, Oregon DEQ, we work with Oregon OSHA, we work with Department of Agriculture. We're really able to share information and share resources in a really streamlined fashion.
Great, and I don't want to tie up the mic, but I have to ask this question, Amanda. You said that the regulation or the locations of the cannabis operations in Oregon are being kept under lock and key. You can't get access to them? I mean, the rest of the world can't get access to them?
So there's 2016 legislation that made the addresses of recreational producers, processors, and wholesalers exempt from the public record. The Oregon legislature probably did that due to safety concerns. We have some really rural or small family farms who are involved in cannabis production, and I think that they were concerned that having their addresses posted on our website would be a safety concern for their families. I don't know how long that will stay in the law, but for right now it is. We can release addresses of retailers.
It's not the producers or the
No, so
wholesalers.
what we're doing right now is just releasing the county location. But like I said before, we can streamline between county and cities law enforcement. So if there's any sort of issues, if a county, a city, law enforcement, anybody like that needed to know, we could tell them. It's just we can't really post it right on our website.
I'm just curious on that one.
Thanks you very much for all of you for great presentations, very interesting. My name is Wesley Ford and I'm from Los Angeles County. Ron or any of you can answer this question, but you all kind of touched on, the discussion around the amount of energy that's required, and you kind of touched on it indirectly, but I'd like to, if you could talk about it more directly. It seems as an emerging industry that requires lots of energy is a discussion about solar or wind or other renewable energy sources, and this seems to be a good time to marriage that industry going forward with those kinds of renewable resources rather than taxing the existing structure. And can any of you comment on that as to working with the industry to make that happen?
Sure. So we kind of started from that point, but what we looked at was the quantity of energy they were consuming, and then realizing that the amount of solar energy that was needed was way beyond anything that they were even remotely able to accomplish on the site. The scale is really hard to imagine. These grows sometimes use just a lot of energy, so it really wasn't even possible. They would, and even if they were able to participate in the existing solar gardens, they would swallow up the entirety and more of the solar gardens available. So there really is a capacity issue with that. So when we first looked at this, we actually had some meetings with some members of the industry, some of the Colorado Solar Energy Industries Association, and some solar garden developers, seeing if we could actually create a solar garden that was dedicated and designed for this industry. We sort of put that on the back burner because it would require the support of the utility, and it would have to go through the PUC. So that the timing on that seemed like that may be a longer term project. But really, in terms of just, can you get a grower to put all those panels on their facility, and it's just way more than they're able to accomplish. It's a lot of solar, a lot of panels.
I guess the only thing I would add to that, in Oregon, we wouldn't make it mandatory, but we definitely wouldn't. I mean, it's a business choice. When we went through a lot of our rulemaking, we really spent a lot of time with the industry. We had an extensive public outreach process in the summer of 2015, and we really wanted to regulate this where regulation was necessary, but then also allow the industry to be able to make their business decisions as other businesses in Oregon would. So really a lot of our regulation, at least at the state level, through the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, focused more on the Cole memo and more on the compliance that we needed to have in place for the federal government, and less on more business decisions. But we do encourage our producers to work with their energy companies and to look for sustainable practices.
One other thing, just to add to that, is it's also clear that the industry is growing and changing really rapidly. The technology is changing rapidly, and before you look for to put renewable energy into the mix, you really need to look at teaching the industry how to use less to begin with. That first step has yet to been accomplished within the industry. So we still have a lot of improvements in terms of just using less, and that's really a good first step.
Any other questions from the audience? I have one. And it's actually for Ron. How accepting were the growers of having the e-gauges installed in their facility? And for some that may have been initially hesitant, did you find that once they saw the data that they were a little bit more excited about the idea?
I would say in general they were pretty supportive. One of the things that was clear before we put the regulation in place was there was a lot of maybe even go as far as say paranoia and fear amongst the growers about losing privacy to that data. So we put in some pretty strong language in the regulations that protected their data, that it's their data, that we weren't going to release it in any kind of way that could be traced back to any particular business, and that really seemed to do the trick. So I would say for the most part they were quite supportive. We also structured it so that the cost of installing those devices comes out of the fees collected from the fund. So the result is that they're not paying directly for the installation of that equipment. That also helped.
I have a quick question, if I could. I'm Elizabeth, and I'm with the City of Boulder, work with Ron quite a bit. And so I guess I'm interested in Denver and Oregon, since all of our cities and states have huge climate goals. How have you interacted with your climate policy folks and your climate action folks on this new industry that has a huge load on our grid?
I can start with that one. I sit about 10 feet away from our climate action folks, so I interact with them quite a bit. But the reality in Denver is that the cannabis industry uses about 2% of our electricity. So while that's statistically significant, they are not the biggest users of concern. So while we are addressing their energy use through these voluntary measures, and wanting them to reduce their carbon impact, they're not the top sector that Denver is concerned with in terms of meeting our climate goals.
And as far as Oregon would be concerned, I mean, most of that work would be done at the legislative level. Really, the outlines for, or any real restrictions or laws that we put in place around energy usage would have to come through a state law. And then we would adapt it through our administrative rules to put it into action. At this point in time, though, since they have given us so much of the information sharing freedom, once we do start to get data, because we use the same tracking system that Colorado does, we use a metric system. And so we'll be able to share our data with our Department of Energy, and we'll be able to actually get some numbers on how much energy is being used. In Oregon, you're allowed to grow indoor or outdoor. And so a lot of the current growing that's going on, since we just started licensing this year, is outdoor. And so they really don't have the energy issue. So we won't really see data on that until we license more of the indoor production up in the metro area, probably.
Great, thanks.
Can I just add one thing that was talked about a little bit earlier, but I think it's really worth emphasizing because this is still illegal at the federal level. We don't have the support of the national laboratories. And that's a big deal, and it has some pretty significant impacts to the industry. Specifically, the one I've been seeing it in a lot is with the lighting issues. So when you look at the energy consumption, lighting is the big driver of this. And it was mentioned earlier that the early bulbs that came out had a big marketing workup, but they weren't able to deliver. And the needs of this industry are different than other needs. So historically, there has been a fair bit of federal research into agricultural lighting, but standard agricultural lighting is not the same, is not what's needed for this industry. What this industry is focused on is fairly subtle when you talk about the chemistry of the cannabinoids and the terpenes that are particularly being selected for, and there really isn't any data that is able to show us how LEDs can deliver that. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of growers out there that have been doing experimentations on their own, and they think they understand what's going on. But having looked at what many of these growers are doing and how they're going about this experimentation, you can see many flaws in the research. They're not researchers. And without that, we have a lot of mythology out there, a lot of misinformation out there, and it's in an unfortunate situation where the industry is really interested in adopting technologies that work, but they do not have the information to make good decisions on this, and it's a real problem that we're trying to work through.
Okay, if we don't have any other audience question, we'll wrap this up. Oh, we have one more.
I am Todd from National Drug Research Institute in Australia. Just about the LED lighting, on that tour on Wednesday, one of the facilities had 36,000 plants and they were almost all LED, so that's obviously a significant investment. If they are doing that, I would have thought that the technology is there and working. Do you mind to comment?
Yeah, I think there are technologies out there that look really promising. The problem is, how do you select which ones are the right ones and which ones aren't? There's sort of a trial and error experimentation going on. When you look at the marketing literature that many of these manufacturers are using, they're citing a lot of their own internal studies. But then when you look at that with any kind of scientific scrutiny, what you see is that they're not necessarily all using the same standards. There really isn't even an established metric, a unit to measure these bulbs. So I was just at the code hearings for the International Code Council, and there was discussion for agricultural lighting, what is the unit that should be used to measure the efficacy of these bulbs, and there isn't consensus there either. So it's going to be a little bit of time before that gets settled out.
Can I just say, I'm Lloyd Covens from West 420, and I think you're kind of beating the LED technology down by not looking at the Silicon Valley. And the issue that we hear is sodium lights can give us 5 harvests. That's great. That's the maximum you can get in a year at the maximum energy and water usage. But if you take LED at this point, you can seriously get 3.5 harvests at half the energy use. So if you're comparing to sodium, yes, they're more powerful. But if you're taking the LED category totally, including the bandwidth, including the LED innovations that have been made for other industries brought into cannabis, I think you're making a very generic response, and you may be leading people to believe LEDs aren't as advanced as they really are.
Well, I apologize if I gave that an impression. I think that the LEDs are absolutely the way that this industry is going to move. But right now, we have this confusion in the marketplace where growers are risk adverse. The crops are expensive, and they're really looking at how to manage this in a reasonable way. And what some of them have gotten pretty significantly impacted by marketing claims that didn't pan out. And so as mentioned before, that sort of interrupts the ability for the industry to adopt these new technologies. When there are marketing claims, people try it doesn't work, and now they're not sure who to believe. And so it's sort of stifling to the industry, the fact that there isn't a trusted source that they can point to and say, this is what I should be looking at when I'm selecting for bulbs.
Thanks, Ron. Could I ask Amanda real quick to touch on the outdoor grows and the impact on the water table that has been felt or that you're trying to work against in terms of water pollution from pesticides and runoffs from the outdoor grows?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we just started licensing outdoor grows this year. We work closely with the Oregon Water Resources Department and with the Oregon Department of Agriculture, and I guess Department of Environmental Quality as well. It kind of touches on all three of those agencies. At this point in time, we don't have data because the harvest has just happened a couple weeks ago. But we have got some complaints. There are two mechanisms really that we're using are the land use compatibility statements, because that means that they're zoned properly and that their local jurisdictions know where they're at. And then the second would be the verification of legal access to water. So they really do have to fill out a form for us and provide verification of how they're legally accessing their water. And then Oregon Department of Water Resources works in a similar way, I guess, to Oregon OSHA. It's a complaint-driven agency. And I'm sure many of you know, if somebody's stealing your water, the first thing you're going to do is pick up the phone and call every state agency that has anything to do with it. So the Oregon Water Resources Department has been great to work with, and they call us on a regular basis when they get complaints. We can send them the paperwork of how the person's verified their water usage, and then they actually go out to the facility and check and make sure that's really happening. And then the wastewater is similar. Department of Agriculture works with them on the wastewater, as does DEQ, just depending on the type of wastewater.
Christopher Mallory, representing Americana. We're actually one of the businesses that are actually underneath Ron. So from the business perspective, I think in general the program is good. A positive I think that Ron mentioned is that you need to be transparent and need to be very open with the businesses, beyond a doubt. We're already getting nailed with a whole bunch of other extra things, where for instance in Boulder, University of Colorado would blow us out of the water with the amount of electricity that they're using, as would Google. So you need to be open to this process and also work with the businesses, which Ron actually does a good job of. From the business perspective, though, we also want to see this, like I said, we want to see some benefit to paying all these extra fees too. And currently, we're still waiting on the steering committee, so hopefully that gets started soon. But we're also a business that's being annexed into the city of Boulder. We have no idea how this is going to affect us. We've been paying into a fund, and we don't know where any of these funds are going to go. The city of Boulder, excuse me. The city of Boulder also has really limited hours, more so than any other jurisdiction in the state of Colorado. So when you're using the energy monitoring device, in theory, it's great because you could stagger your usage times, as Ron kind of described a little bit, and he's also set up things before where he's brought in people from that company to show you how to use it to your advantage, which is great, and they should continue to do that. Problem being is now that we're going into the city of Boulder, being one of the first businesses ever annexed into a different jurisdiction, their hours are so limiting, we actually can't take advantage of that. We have to operate, depending on how the annexation is decided, during peak hours. So if your program expands, I just suggest that you work with the city and remind them that the only way to really take advantage of this is to not have those peak hours. Because if that happens, it's good for your data collection, but for us, there's literally no positive at all. So I just ask that as it goes forward, if you could be kind of a person to describe what's going on and the advantages of letting growers, for instance, do the 24 hours a day. They're not open to the public. And in the county, you are allowed to do that. And it's also really good for public health things, because if you're going to spray, you can spray at night after everyone is gone and the building's closed, and you can let the HVAC take care of it. But if you have to do it during the day, when all your employees are there, it's extremely restrictive and also dangerous. And the City of Boulder's program doesn't seem to understand that, and we're working with that right now. But just for your knowledge, that's kind of what's going on. So if you could kind of tell the positives of that from the county's program to the city, since you work with them very often, that would be really appreciated, because we want to do these things. These things are important. But we also have to be able to use them to our benefit, or else it's just one more thing, one more layer of regulation or money that we're paying in when we don't have all the other things that other businesses have. Banks, loans, those kind of things. Hopefully it'll get better in the future, but in the meantime, that's what we're dealing with. So it would be very helpful if you could do that.
Thank you. That's an interesting point. You know, this is not, it's sort of an unusual thing. We have some businesses that had been part of Boulder County that are now getting annexed in the city. So it's bringing up a number of issues that I don't think anyone has ever worked on before. So thank you.
All right, thank you all so much for your great questions.